Hello, this is another podcast around Doctor Who, continuing these sort of reviews of past episodes. This particular one is The Invisible Enemy, which is, as you'll see from the cover art, a Tom Baker episode from 1977 in this case. The reason I've chosen this one, it's not one of the best stories. It's the budget was very constrained and it's rather clunky at times in terms of its special effects and things like that. But as anyone who follows my blog page or who knows me personally will be aware, my husky died recently. Dear old thing, he was 18, and it's a long time to be in someone's life. You share your life with them for 18 years, and then unfortunately he went. And this particular episode is the one in which K9, the Doctor's dog, becomes a character in the ongoing show. This is where he was introduced, which is why I've chosen this one. So in terms of a quick plot summary for what goes on, there's a sort of what we call it, a cloud of virus, this sort of germ cloud, I know germs and viruses aren't the same thing, but disease cloud floating in the depths of space near to the planet Saturn. And a spaceship, not the most convincing looking of spaceships, but a spaceship flies through this viral cloud, and the people on board get affected, and then the TARDIS flies through the cloud, and the Doctor gets affected, but at first he isn't aware that he's been affected. And Leela, his companion, is immune for various reasons that come to light in the show. The TARDIS and the spaceship then land on a base that's on the moon of Titan, which is one of the moons of Saturn that goes around Saturn. That's where the virus wants to get to, because the breeding conditions, the atmosphere and so on Titan are ideal for its reproductive purposes. But it's not simply wanting to reproduce itself as any kind of living entity wants. It wants to move from the microscopic world into the macroscopic world. It wants to become a presence in the... So it's not just kind of living as a parasitic organism, hosting in other creatures' bodies. It becomes a presence in the large world in its own right, which I find quite engaging as an idea. It appeals to my sort of animist side, that obviously due to budget constraints and that sort of thing, the majority of aliens and monsters in Doctor Who are basically people in rubber costumes and masks. They all look very, very humanoid, the majority of them. Every now and then they'll come up with either a really, as in this 1977 episode, an innovative costume, or they'll, with modern day CGI being that much fancier than it was in the classical series, they'll come up with a really weird, strange looking alien that's very non-human. And I like that. I'd like to see more of that. But what I also like about this is that something that we would classically think of in 21st century science as not having a mind, not having any sapience or presence of virus. We know viruses are alive, but we don't think of them as living. Don't think of them as sapient, as thinking entities with personality and so on. In this case, has a personality, it has a presence, it has mind, and it's an example of something you don't see an awful lot of in Doctor Who, but every now and then they'll have a being from what we call an area of life that modern Western scientific rationalist humanity does not think of as being sapient. So you get plant monsters like the crinoid or the vervoids, or the living seaweed back in the day of Patrick Troughton, or living rocks, thinking crystalline entities, such as in another Tom Baker episode, The Hand of Fear. Things that we don't tend to think of as alive that actually are alive on the show, and thinking and plotting and planning and having ideas and schemes and all sorts of weird mad things. And I like that it appeals to that sort of animist impulse within my own theological perception of the universe. And more of that in Doctor Who, please, in the coming years. I would personally quite like to see this episode, well, not the episode, but the alien from the episode revived in a few years' time. Some future Doctor maybe who has to battle the what's referred to as the nucleus, the kind of the nucleus of the swarm, the chief virus, I suppose, for lack of a better word, the dominating presence. It's not a group mind per se, in that when the virus infects people, they sprout these sort of mad, bushy eyebrows and scabby bits on their skin, but they don't automatically know somebody else has been infected until one of them says contact has been made, and that's how they establish that the other person has been infected. So they don't have a collective mind, but the nucleus, the primary baddie, the primary alien, dominates the whole swarm. When he's there's a part of the series, it's a 4-part program, where, because the Doctor's infected, they clone him, and they take a clone of Leela and they shrink them down. These are very short-lived clones, only last 10 minutes or so. They shrink them down to microscopic level and inject them in the Doctor's body. So there's this whole sequence where they're walking inside the Doctor's body, kind of like they're sort of, that theme, that idea was repeated in a couple of years ago in the revived show, when they all got miniaturized. The Doctor and some other characters got miniaturized and injected inside a Dalek, and they were inside the Dalek, wandering around, which personally I thought was a bit of a silly episode, but same kind of an idea of being inside another living being. Which is obviously a bit of a straight rip-off from the film Fantastic Voyage, which is exactly what happens in that film, although with a bigger budget and better special effects. Even down to the attack of the phagocytes eating various baddies that also get injected into the Doctor's body. The Doctor at least meets the virus inside his own body, and it's this just kind of thing with a claw, and it's a big, looks like someone's chucked a blanket over a person and they've just got their hand inside a puppet claw wailing around. When it's removed from the Doctor's body inside the chamber that shrunk him, that then kind of grows the clone back to full size, the virus grows to full size and it changes completely. Instead of being just a claw poking out of a black blanket with one glassy eyeball, it turns into what Tom Baker, in an interview he did, one of these sort of DVD overview things, voiceovers, as a giant prawn. It does look quite like a giant prawn. It's got those kind of lots of long feelers coming out, and it's that kind of prawn curved shape and very, very weird looking thing. I'm sure with modern day CGI they could make it a lot fancier and a lot flashier, but I think that idea of a sapient virus, and it's very much like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where if they maybe mended the bushy eyebrows and the scabby bits, so that you weren't initially sure who was infected and who wasn't, you could have quite a lot of paranoia going on in a modern day episode. Who is part of this swarm, who is uninfected as a human being, or whatever species they decide to do it with. That, I think, would work really well. The shows like Midnight, which build heavily, that was a David Tennant episode, build heavily on the idea of paranoia, people locked on a vehicle, they can't get out, they don't know who's dangerous, who's not dangerous, people going madder and madder, and that sort of feeding on human paranoia. Those sorts of episodes, really claustrophobic, intense, quite dramatic in a lot of ways, work really, really well. And I think in a similar way with the Midnight episode, where you never really see the alien, well, we don't see the alien at all. It possesses people, so it speaks through them. So there's no monster costume. It's just suddenly somebody goes insane and they start behaving in a very, very weird, creepy way. They could reuse that idea. So there could be a final confrontation with the virus as a giant prawn or whatever. But for the majority of the episode, they could do it where you don't quite know who is, who isn't, until they start acting oddly. And it would build on that sort of tension and atmosphere. They'd have to get some really good actors for that one, which is why I think they should wait a few years until they've got new actors in place, because the current batch aren't particularly good at all. That would really, really work well, I think. So what else is worth mentioning? K9 I've touched on already. The plot device there is that there is a kind of a slightly potty professor, Professor Marius, played by Frederick Jaeger, who lived to a ripe old age. dead now. He had his dog on Earth, his pet dog, beloved pet dog on Earth, but he couldn't bring the dog with him when he went to the moon base on Titan because it talks about the weight load on the spaceship going over. So he's arrived on this space station and he's built a mechanical dog, a computerized dog, as a substitute for his real dog back on Earth, and that is K9. Without, well, I suppose I already spoiled it quite a lot, so what's it matter? By the end of the episode, the professor is getting ready to go back to Earth, and it's the same problem. He can't take too much extra weight with him. There's obviously very strict restrictions on baggage and all that kind of thing. So he can't take K9 with him, and he says to the doctor, will you take K9? And K9 is a lovely little bit where the dog doesn't even wait for an answer, he just tramples into the TARDIS. And he's obviously made his own mind up on this one. And he becomes this much loved character. He persisted for a few years alongside Tom Baker, and then he reappears with Sarah Jane Smith when she had a very short-lived spin-off with the Sarah Jane Adventures, and he's with her there. And he reappears later when she has another much more successful spin-off in the Sarah Jane Adventures, where she's kind of a doctor-like figure with teenagers as her companions. And again, K9, a bit of a background figure, but he's still there. And resurfaces in a David Tennant episode with the school reunion, and he's just hugely popular. He did apparently have a spin-off show in Australia where they totally redesigned K9. I've never seen that show, but I have seen a photograph online of the redesigned K9, and he's just crap. Not like the proper K9 at all. Going back to the sort of Tom Baker commentary DVD voiceover bit, he found the prop of K9, he liked the character, the idea of K9, but he found the prop quite annoying because it would constantly break down, and then they'd have to do retake after retake, and they'd fanny around trying to repair it and everything else. So as an actual functioning prop, it was quite limited in some respects, but hugely popular. Isn't it? The man and his dog in space, isn't it? That has a tremendous appeal to that whole. There's so many films and shows and novels and things centered about the relationship between a man and his dog. It kind of goes to the core of something very deep in humanity, I think. The guy who does the voice for K9, John Leeson, also did the voice for the Nucleus of the Storm, so he was both the heroic new companion and the sinister virus as well. One other actor in the show is worth a bit of a mention, Michael Shard, who plays the supervisor on the moon base on Titan, who subsequently gets infected and all sorts of things happen. He was in loads of episodes of Doctor Who, quite famous for appearing as the rather miserable Mr. Bronson in Grange Hill back in the day. I've never met the man, dead now, never met him, but I've read commentary from people who did meet him at conventions and worked with him in the film and theatre and one thing and another. He played Hitler loads of times and lots of nasty villains and Nazis, not just Hitler, other Nazis as well. But apparently in real life he was a really nice, kind, gentle, lovely man, despite playing all these sinister, miserable, villainous characters, which I always think is quite an interesting kind of dichotomy of the acting profession, that you can get people who are fantastic villains on the screen, very sinister, very menacing, very, very frightening, and then in real life they're absolutely lovely. And I'm sure there must be cases of people who are sort of noble and heroic and wonderful on the screen, and then complete arses when you meet them in real life. That's just the way of things. But that's a kind of an interesting appeals to my kind of background in psychology. That dichotomy of how people can create a persona that's very at odds with what they're like when the cameras are turned off and they go back to real life. That's a separate issue entirely. But if you haven't watched The Invisible Enemy, do. It is, as I say, the budget on it was not fantastically high, so a lot of the special effects are a bit clunky, and there's bits where you can kind of see the cameraman in the corner, that sort of thing. In it, it's not done as well as it could be done. But the ideas, the concept, the notion of this thinking, malevolent, sinister disease that wants to not just infect people, but actually become a physical menace, in the real universe it's quite pronounced. And there's this scene towards the end where I'm not sure if egg is quite the right word, the sort of, but they look like eggs anyway. The virus has laid all of these sort of egg-like things, these breeding things, and they're in a chamber and they're bubbling away with slime and goo. And it's sort of reminiscent of that scene in Aliens, in the Sigourney Weaver film with the pods and the Gremlins, when there is a scene in Gremlins when there's all these millions of sort of egg pod things that are about to explode and there's slime and goop everywhere, and it is quite disgusting and quite unpleasant, and I'm sure gave a few kids nightmares about that one, which is what Doctor Who should do, give people nightmares, especially children. They like a good scare, so do try and watch it if you haven't. It's not the best, but it is very entertaining and a very engaging episode. And certainly, if you're a dog lover, there is K9. What can I say?